across America. Live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Monday edition of Point of View, Star Wars Day. May the 4th be with you, and we certainly do want to encourage you to enjoy this day as we are going to spend some time in the first hour talking about the Supreme Court in a kind of a different way. Oftentimes on Friday, we have Kelly Shackelford or somebody from First Liberty talking about some of the Supreme Court cases. Sometimes we have Lathan Watts, Vice President of Alliance Defending Freedom, during the week. But I think in this case, we are going to really get into the need for us to hold the court accountable, to pray for the court, and to really benefit from some things we're going to hear from Phillip Jauregui. He is a lawyer, prayer leader, and founder of a group called the Judicial Action Group. We have information about that on our website at pointofview.net. Also, the author of this book will be talking about the parable of the Prodigal Court. Came out a couple months ago, but if you are looking for it, probably the easiest way is to find it on their website or ours, because if you do find it in the bookstore, great, but I think it will be helpful for you to know we have a link there as well. He has really been devoted, and the organization been devoted to judicial renewal in the United States. For decades, they have really combined the whole issue of intercessory prayer and constitutional advocacy as we talk about wanting to call the Supreme Court back to, in a sense, its original founding and its noble cause. So we're going to be talking about that today. And I might just mention this book is available, the foreword by Dutch Sheets, and endorsed by a veritable who's who of people that we've had on the program, Jim Garlow and Michelle Bachman and Walker Wildman and many others. So I think you will certainly appreciate that. So first of all, Phillip, welcome to Point of View. Do we have Phillip there? Well, we'll try to get Phillip on there in just a minute. Let's see what we can do to connect that up there. And what are we missing there? Do we need to... Are you on now? Not a good way to get started here, but we'll see what we can come up with. Let me just mention that we are talking about this issue of the book, The Parable of a Prodigal Court, your invitation to shift a nation back to God. And I think we now maybe have Phillip. Phillip, you with us now? Well, we are having our difficulties. So we'll see what we can do to deal with that. If not, we'll move on to some other topics that we certainly need to address here at Point of View. But again, just thought I would take some time to tell you a little bit more about this book, The Parable of the Prodigal Court, your invitation to shift a nation back to God. And Phillip, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby. Can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
Praise God.
And I am so sorry that came off that way, but nevertheless, that is the case. Well, let's, if we can, get into this, because
Sure.
I've seen one of the videos that you've done where you talk about having stood in front of the Supreme Court. This is like decades ago. And then when you watched the video, you said, goodness, I guess I was much more angry about the court than I had anticipated. So rather than curse the darkness, you came up with a strategy to light some lamps. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, we'll say God came up with a strategy. He had to correct me on that, but the first time, Kerby, was probably 18 years ago, but we filmed a video up there at the court, and I was talking about the problem of the Supreme Court and all the dishonorable things that they've done, and we can talk about that, but I just saw that I was very angry about it, and I was a little surprised. And so what the Lord showed me about 8 years ago, Kerby, we were praying for the court. We have a group of about 40 or 50 intercessors that meet every Friday morning, and we pray for the court, and it's a great group of people. But as we were praying, I just had this picture of the Supreme Court in my mind and felt this incredible feeling of love. And it was really odd. In a way, it was normal, because we can use our imaginations every day in a normal way. So it was that type of thing. But yet it really came out of the blue. And the feeling of love really shocked me, because I thought, I've never felt that before for that place. And it really exposed what my heart was, which was, to say I didn't like the court would be an understatement.
Yes.
I think I hated them.
Yes, you say that in the book. Yeah.
Yeah. And there are a lot of reasons to be upset with them, as I say in the book. I mean, we can detail those things. These are legitimate, major concerns, things that the court has done to literally breach our national relationship with God. And that's not a small matter. But what God spoke to me in that moment 8 years ago, and he didn't speak to me audibly, but what I was sensing in my heart from him was, Philip, you can be upset about what they've done, and that's legitimate. But what if I want to do something different, and I want you to have faith? In other words, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. And we can see, Kerby, what the court has done. I could see everything that the court has done. But I think what the Lord was saying, if I want to do something different, I want you to have a vision for that new thing and pray for that. Have faith for not where they are or where they've been, but let's have faith for something of where I want to take them. And then what the Lord started speaking to me about was the parable of the prodigal son, and showing me the heart of the father for the son, who, like the court, had done some incredibly, to say it was dishonorable, I mean, it was beyond that. It was evil what the son had done, and the same with the court. But the heart of the father was to say, I want that boy back.
Right.
And I think that's the heart of our Father for the Supreme Court, is to see them back in his house, back honoring their original noble role.
And again, it's parable of the prodigal court. And just before I take a break, though, one of the things I thought I might mention is if you're trying to capture the country, you don't have to capture 435 members of the House of Representatives, don't have to capture even 100 U.S. senators. You don't even have to capture all 9 Supreme Court justices, because if you can just capture 5, then all of a sudden you can redefine marriage, you can decide whether or not you can have prayer in the schools, you can decide whether or not you can post the 10 Commandments. And in some respects, you point out the fact that it illustrates how just a few individuals have had such an impact on this country. That's right. And so it heightens for us. I mean, a lot of people even know how to impact the congressional branch or the legislative branch, the executive branch, but the judicial branch is maybe a more difficult branch to impact. But that's where we feel God has called us to impact that branch, both through intercessory prayer, but then also through what we call governmental activism, being involved in the nomination process, researching future Supreme Court judges, and the ongoing nominations. So it's an honor for us to get to work in that branch, and we love it. Well, we're going to take a break. When we come back, I want to talk a little bit about this idea of the prodigal son and the prodigal court. And then you do take some time to kind of give us a little bit of history, because that's important. You know, some of these ideas will get us to Marlborough versus Madison and things like that, began in the beginning, but then by the time you get to 1947, this idea of separation of church and state, all sorts of ideas really moved in the wrong direction. So I do want you to give us a little bit of judicial history, but when we come back, let's, if we can, talk a little bit about, why this idea of a prodigal court fits very well with a prodigal son, which we read about in Scripture. So let's take a break. We are privileged to have with us today Phillip Jauregui, and we're going to come back and continue our conversation with him right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The editors of National Review said it best with their headline, Manufacturing Racism. They were talking about the recent revelations about the Southern Poverty Law Center. A half-century ago, when it began, it was doing responsible work by pointing to racism and encouraging laws and governments to bring about change. 2 weeks ago, the Department of Justice announced an 11-count indictment against the center on charges of wire fraud, false statements to a bank, and conspiracy to commit money laundering. Apparently, the leaders had been secretly funding informants and providing funds to racist organizations, essentially manufacturing racism to supposedly fight racism. An even greater concern for many Christian organizations has been the center's attempt to label worthwhile Christian and conservative groups with a hate label. Their so-called research led the group to attack groups like the Family Research Council, American Family Association, Alliance Defending Freedom, Focus on the Family, Turning Point USA, and Moms for Liberty. We've also learned that the federal government has used their materials to indoctrinate soldiers and encourage federal agencies to investigate law-abiding Americans. We've been told by some of the leaders that Christian nationalist and conservative haters are the greatest threat to America's security. Will this indictment lead to convictions? When we discussed the issue on my radio program, we concluded that it may not result in criminal convictions, even though the center was certainly defrauding their donor base. The latest news has been an embarrassment for the center and has served to educate many Americans about the harm that they have inflicted on worthwhile organizations. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Conversation today is the Supreme Court as we talk about the parable of the Prodigal Court, your invitation to shift a nation back to God. Phillip Jauregui is with us, and we're talking about, at the moment, this idea of, the prodigal son. In Luke 15, it starts out with, there was a man who had two sons, but you use that, Phillip, to really talk about the idea that there was a noble role and purpose for the Supreme Court, and you can think of, in the Federalist Papers at the time, it was described as the weakest of all branches. Now, in some respects, 5 individuals can determine what more than 300 million people in the United States can do and practice. But I think in some respects it reminds us again why you use this concept of a prodigal court. Can you explain?
Sure. So when the judiciary was formed, it says in the Constitution that their job, that the text says that they're there to decide cases. And I like to kind of explain it by saying, Kerby, if some of us decided to form a new nation, we found a land somewhere and we moved there, we'd have to decide, okay, how are we going to govern ourselves? And the 3 branches is a great way to start. You have the legislative branch. That's the branch that makes the rules. They legislate. They make all the rules that we live by, whether it's a criminal statute or a speed limit or tax policy. Then you have Article 2, the executive branch. That's the branch that's responsible for police power or enforcing the laws. That's the president and his cabinet in the federal system. But then you have a 3rd branch, and that would be the judiciary. And their job would be to decide a dispute between people. So you have a law that says, here's how things operate, but what happens when people don't follow the law, either in a criminal sense or in a civil sense? Like if you had 2 neighbors in this new nation and they were having a dispute on whether the fence was on the property line. And that's kind of a silly example, but what happens? Well, hopefully they talk about it and they can resolve it. If they can't, maybe one of them gets a lawyer and they start looking at the legal issues and one of them writes a letter. But if they still can't agree, if you don't have a court system, you end up settling it with guns or fistfights. So that's where courts come in. They're there to, quote, decide cases, is what it says in the Constitution.
Right.
But they're not there to make governmental policy. And that's what's happened in this nation for the last 60, 70 years is the courts have been the one exercising Article 1 legislative policy or legislative power, and that's not what we want. So we're talking now about getting that corrected, and I think we're on our way.
One of the things that you talk about after talking about this third branch is to remind people, and this probably is new information for some of our listeners, that the first branch of government, well, it got the U.S. Capitol. Second branch of government, well, that's the executive, got the White House. Third branch got nothing, because if you've ever had a tour of the U.S. Capitol, they'll take you down to kind of one of the lower levels of the Capitol where originally the U.S. judiciary, the Supreme Court, met. And I think it illustrates, again, the point I made just a minute ago, that originally it was seen as the kind of the weakest of all branches. It was necessary, but it wasn't as significant as it's become now, because when we think of the Supreme Court, we think of the Supreme Court building, which I know you've been in many times, and many people probably had a tour of that. And that, I think, shows how much of that has changed, and you refer to that as kind of a grievous exchange. Can you explain?
Sure. So if you just put yourself in the seat of the justices of the court, and this is not Kerby to make excuses for what they did, abusing power, but I think if we go back and really think about what happened. So the Capitol was not originally in Washington, D.C. It was originally in New York and Philadelphia, but then they were moving it to Washington, D.C., and they had an architect, and they had acres and acres of land, and they were designing this new Capitol. And they made provisions for the first branch of government. They built a big, beautiful white Capitol called the U.S. Capitol. And they built a building for the second branch, the president, and it was originally called the Presidential Palace, which is now the White House. But no provision was made for the third branch of government. And it wasn't because they didn't have the money or the space for it. They just didn't build a building for them. They ended up putting them in some spare space in the basement of the U.S. Capitol. And then, interestingly, when they built a new wing onto the Capitol building for the Senate, big, new, beautiful wing for the Senate, they gave the Supreme Court the old Senate chambers. And I compare it to the younger brother, who's never getting his own. He's getting hand-me-downs. He doesn't get a new shirt. He gets his older brother's used shirts. And so, but what happens to somebody that you treat that way? When you're told you're not good enough and you don't get your own and you're not honored, what happens? And I think one of the things that can happen is they end up trying to seize power that they don't have because they're told the power that they have isn't good enough. Yeah. And I think that's what happened with the U.S. Supreme Court. And it's one of the reasons they started usurping power. Again, I'm not excusing it, but I'm trying to explain what I think happened.
Again, I love that because you talk about the Supreme Court's little brother syndrome. And again, coming back to this idea, the Prodigal Court is the case. But, okay, you've given us kind of a history lesson, and I'll take your history hat off for a minute and now maybe put your lawyer's hat back on, because it would be good to talk about Chief Justice John Marshall, and this is Marbury versus Madison. And I was thinking, Philip, the last time we had somebody talk about Marbury versus Madison was when we had Judge Robert Bork on the program, because he had that in his book. But let's, if we can, for people that don't remember their American history, talk about that case, because that, according even to people like Judge Robert Bork and others, changed the nature of the way in which the court was to decide these issues. Can you explain that?
Sure. So they coined what was called a concept called judicial review. And basically what that meant was, and there was a lot that was true, by the way, in the Marbury v. Madison case. There's a problem with it, as we'll see. But the basic premise was judges take their oaths to the Constitution just like members of Congress, same as the president. But judges take their oaths to the Constitution. And so what happened in Marbury v. Madison is the judges had to decide whether a statute, which is a law passed by members of Congress, which is different, of course, than a constitutional provision. It's lower than it. So if a statute conflicts with the text of the Constitution, and you're deciding a case as a judge, and the result or the winner of the lawsuit, if it turns on the statute, is party A, but the winner of the lawsuit, if it turns on the meaning of the Constitution, is party B, what do you do? Well, that's what happened in Marbury v. Madison. And so the justices had to decide, we take our oath to the Constitution, So if a statute passed by Congress, even though we want to honor it, conflicts with the Constitution, then we have to go with the Constitution. That's the concept of judicial review. The problem, though, Kerby, is what Chief Justice Marshall did in writing that opinion. And I think he arrived at the right result, but he plugged this phrase into the case that he wrote, which said, it is emphatically the province and duty of the judiciary to say what the law is.
Yeah.
It's an interesting statement and can be subject to twisting. And I think it was vague. There's a sense in which you can read that statement and think, maybe that's okay. The problem is it wasn't read as being okay. And you can say, what is the definition of province and duty? Well, province can carry with it this sense of exclusivity. In other words, it's the judiciary's exclusive job and duty to say what the law is.
Wow. Well, we're going to take a break. Yeah, I want to take a break in just a minute and get into some of the other aspects of that. But one of the people you quote in here is an individual I've known for many years, and we've interviewed him on this program, Herb Titus, in which he refers to this. We call these judicial opinions, but there's a difference between giving you an opinion, which might be binding on that particular case, and one that applies to the entire country. So we haven't really gotten into that yet. So we certainly want to take a break, and I don't want to cut you off any further. So I wanted to mention that we are once again making it possible for you to find out more about this particular issue. So first of all, if you go to the website, you'll see a picture of Phillip, and you will see that we have a link there that takes you to the Judicial Action Group, which is JAGF.org. You don't have to remember all that, but that is on the website, so you can find out more about that group and find out more about how you can be praying for the Supreme Court and how you can also be involved with them. If you scroll down a little bit more, you're going to see information about the parable of the Prodigal Court, your invitation to shift a nation back. And this book has been out a couple of months, so you might be able to find it in your local bookstore, but if not, there's a place for you to get it in paperback and Kindle. And when we come back, we just started, but in some respects, this helps us understand why we are where we are today with the Supreme Court. We'll be right back.
Have you ever met a child you knew would do great things? They displayed remarkable imagination, understanding, and a zest for learning. Now imagine someone takes that child and instead of fostering their potential with a real education, they feed them nothing but lies. You know, that scenario isn't so far from reality. From a young age, Americans are fed a consistent stream of distorted facts, from the secular indoctrination they receive in many public schools, to the biases presented as fact in many colleges and universities, to the barrage of misinformation from the mainstream media and the lack of moral grounding in our society. It's not that Americans aren't capable of understanding the truth, it's that they aren't exposed to it enough. You can expose more Americans to the truth when you give to Point of View, where listeners receive facts, perspective, and biblical truth they don't get from society. As long as we have truth, we have hope. Give today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Continuing our conversation today with Phillip Jauregui as we talk about a number of very important issues. One of those, article we posted a while back from the Washington Times, leftist judges undermining the presidency, how Congress and the executive branch can check overreaching courts, and that is one that Phillip has written about. We've quoted from him before. You can find some of those articles on our website at pointofview.net. Also learn a little bit more about the Judicial Action Group. But But Philip, in some respects, when we come back to this issue of John Marshall, in some respects, he opened the door to say, well, we know what the Supreme Court is. We know what the Constitution says. We know what the laws say. But really, the Constitution is what the justices of the Supreme Court say it is. And that really opened the door, didn't it?
It did. And, they can repeat the law. So they can say what the law is in the sense that they can repeat it, but they can't change it and amend it. And that's what began happening. And it happened by degrees, but you don't get heading in the other direction sometimes all at once. Sometimes it takes errors by degrees, and that's what we saw with the U.S. Supreme Court, to the point where, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, even into 2015, they were literally creating entirely new policies. I mean, big things like the right to abortion or the right to homosexual marriage, with zero basis in the text of the Constitution. They were amending it if they could. Of course, they're not allowed to, but they were effectively amending the Constitution.
Yes.
And so that's being corrected now. But golly, the distance we came from Marbury v. Madison to where we were in a lot of cases in this nation, it's horrible. And it took us away from being a constitutional republic and turning us into a judicial oligarchy where we're ruled by as few as 5 unelected lawyers, as you mentioned when we started the program.
Well, again, we were the other day doing a conversation with Kelly Shackelford, one of our guests, who is younger, and I said to our guest, our co-host, that at that point, when Kelly and I were talking about all these successes, I said, you got to recognize that back when Marlon Maddox was the host and we'd be sitting around the table, we'd just be hanging our heads with all these different decisions going the wrong direction, and in some respects, things have changed. And before we go on to how that unfolded, you did have a chapter there which talked about some of what originally the Supreme Court was, and you quote the first Chief Justice, John Jay. And I always love to, when I talk about John Jay, point out the fact that, first of all, he was one of the writers of the Federalist Papers. He also had served for a time as the vice president of the American Bible Society. Later was even the president of the American Bible Society. He'd been the governor of New York. But I always use this as an illustration. Imagine if there's an opening on the Supreme Court and President Donald Trump decides to appoint the current president of the American Bible Society. You can imagine the controversy, but that shows you maybe where we've come from, because when it came time for the selection of the first Chief Justice, this was an individual that was known more for his understanding of the Bible than for the fact that he'd actually been to anything that looked like a law school.
That's right. And one of the other things that he said, and this is in the book, Kerby, but it's almost like, can we even say this right now? Are we allowed to say this in America? Repeating what Chief Justice John Jay said. But it would be scandalous today, but it was true then, and it still is true now. He said, it is our privilege as well as our duty to prefer and elect Christians for our rulers. Think about that. That was the first Chief Justice, not just some random judge, the Chief Justice, the first one who really laid out the job of a Chief Justice. But when you think about, why would that be? Well, I like to say, if you have a car or a truck that runs on diesel fuel, you need to put diesel fuel into it. If you give it unleaded gas, you're going to have a problem. And there are a lot of forms of government all over the world throughout history and even today. But our form of government is based on biblical principles. That's just historically true. That's really not even a spiritual statement. It's just a factual historical statement. So if you're going to have a form of government that's based on biblical principles, you might want to have people who understand biblical principles running the government. That's really what John Jay was saying, and in that sense, it makes a lot of sense.
It does. And again, you got some other great quotes there from John Adams, but some people might say, okay, that was the first Chief Justice, but okay, let's get into the 19th and 20th century. Okay, let's get into the 19th century, because at this time you have President James Madison. Who was he? Well, again, one of the writers of the Federalist Papers, oftentimes seen as the architect of the Constitution, and he selects a man by the name of Joseph Story for the Supreme Court. And from again, the Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story, who was a professor of law at Harvard at the time, he goes on to continue talking about this idea of how to look at the Constitution from a biblical worldview, doesn't he?
Absolutely. And one of the things he said was, this is a quote, he said, "There's never been a period of history in which the common law did not recognize Christianity as lying at its foundation." And again, this supports the statement that we made, Kerby, which is that Christianity is at the foundation of our common law. It's at the foundation of our nation. And again, that's not a theological statement. It's just a fact. And someone could be an atheist and affirm that statement because it's just true. They may not like it, but that's the history of our nation and the history of our legal system.
Well, let's see if we can then kind of bring it up to date, because we've been talking about this idea of the prodigal son, and there's a statement where eventually the prodigal son comes to his senses, and you refer to that as an awakening, because now we're starting to see some of this changing rather dramatically, and in some respects, I've got to believe that it has to do with not only the people we put on the court, but also the prayers that you have been praying about the court. What about this idea of this awakening?
Yeah, when we started praying for the court in this new sense and it was in 2018, we took a group of people up to Washington, D.C. and literally went into the U.S. Supreme Court building. As tourists, we weren't demonstrating or protesting or causing a scene. People are allowed to go there. But we did that, and we started praying for the court, praying for them like a prodigal son. But one of the questions that I had in my mind, because, of course, we can read the whole story of the prodigal son, but the part that I love, there are a lot of great parts in that parable, but for me, the most special moment is the moment where he's in that far country. He's as far away from his dad as he can be. But there's a moment where it says, but he came to his senses and then decided, I'll go back to my father's house. And I love that part because that's the turning point. And it took him a while to get home because he was in a far country. He wasn't on the other side of the hill in a tree fort. He was in a far country. So the journey would have taken time. And I think because of that too, Kerby, we need to understand that the court's journey back to its proper role is not instantaneous. And so when we see the court mess up from time to time, I like to think of it as the prodigal son on its way home. It took a while, and he probably had some moments where I thought, do I really want to do this? And reconsidered, or he may have taken 2 steps forward and 1 back. He may have tripped and skinned his knee. And so I think we need to have patience with the court when they're making their way back and when they make mistakes, to not say, well, the court's a mistake or that justice is a mistake, but to say what they did is a mistake. But let's keep praying for the court. Let's not give up. Let's not give up on them, because when we see the bigger picture of what's happening, it's astounding what's happened in the last 5 years, even with the Supreme Court coming home.
For sure. Going to take another break, but I might just mention there is where, of course, you do mention Herb Titus, but also Matt Lockett, who we've had on the program as well. These are individuals that certainly have been praying about what is happening and have been very much involved and some of the key battles. But I thought, if nothing else, when we come back from the break, you might talk about how some of that has turned around. I've used a couple of examples. 1947, this idea of separation of church and state. Of course, 1973, Roe versus Wade, 1980, Stone versus Graham, which has to do with the idea of posting the 10 Commandments. Oh, I skipped off one, 1971, that would be the Lemon Test. Many of those things have been reversed. And in some respects, there is more to do, Philip. I know that you would certainly agree with that, but we might also, for a minute, talk about some of the remarkable changes. And there was a sense of maybe frustration around this table a number of years ago. Now that we've been doing Point of View for more than 50 years, Marlon Maddox started it more than 50 years ago, we have gone from seeing some really disastrous decisions. We've now seen many of those reversed, and what maybe the future might hold, and how we can be involved with the Judicial Action Group in terms of prayer and even helping with judicial renewal. So let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Phillip Jauregui, as we talk about the very important issue of Judicial Action Group and Judicial Action Foundation. Now, the Judicial Action Group Foundation is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that, of course, works with the Judicial Action Group, which is a 501c4. But if you would like to find out more information, you can go to our website, pointofview.net, and go to jagf.org, and you can find out more about the foundation. There's a place where you can enter your email for a community update, and this is, again, one nation under God, one judiciary under prayer. Together through prayer, we believe God can restore the courts to their constitutional design. And back to the book of the parable of the Prodigal Court, Philip, one of the things I think so interesting is, again, you come to that story of the prodigal son where there's repentance. Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. And you use that to say, is there a place for us to repair our national relationship to God by restating the truth of our relationship to him, identifying the breaches, repenting of the breach of our national relationship, and even calling for forgiveness of that? And it seems to me that that is the kind of culmination not only of the story of the prodigal son, but certainly our marching orders and our next steps for the prodigal court.
That's right. And we're seeing that happen. We're seeing the court returning home, and it's happening by degrees. But one of the things, Kerby, that for me is important to see, there are a lot of problems, a lot of bad cases that we've seen from the Supreme Court involving abortion. There you're talking about over 65 million children. That's genocide. We could talk about the destruction of marriage, and we could talk about pornography and indecency, and even other things like the Second Amendment, tax policy. There's a lot of things we could talk about at the Supreme Court.
Right.
But a lot of those, as I see it, those are the fruit of a root problem. And the root problem is the breaching of our national relationship with God. And we have to get that corrected, because if we don't, then we're just dealing with the fruit. And we may see some victory from time to time to various degrees with some of these fruit issues, but we still have a root problem. And so we have to get back and restore our national relationship with God. That's what's most important. And then from that, we can see good fruit flowing. It actually makes sense biblically when you think about it like that.
Well, again, we will in the second hour be talking about what's happening on May 17th, the rededicating 250, a national jubilee of prayer and praise. Also have a piece by Jerry Newcomb about America Needs the Bible. But we are talking about a lot of different cases. I rattled some of those off, but, Everson versus the Board of Education, 1947. You, of course, have Engel versus Vitale, which took prayer out of the schools, 62. Also, Abington versus Shempton, 63. You had, of course, the Lemon Test, we mentioned, 71. As well as, of course, the abortion issue, and, of course, Stone versus Graham in 1980. Of course, you mentioned some having to do with everything from the Second Amendment to pornography. So there is a lot that has taken place. We do see some significant changes. So for a person that may be skeptical that we can't possibly bring about any kind of change, it does seem to me that we do have an opportunity as we pray for those individuals who are actually on the court. That is something that we really need to mobilize, and that's one of the things that people can find out about by simply going to your website and seeing how they can get involved in praying for these members of the Supreme Court.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that, and I'll add too. We are a prayer ministry. You mentioned the 501c3, and that's our spiritual activism wing. But then our governmental activism wing is the C4 Judicial Action Group. And that's where we've researched over 35 different prospects for the U.S. Supreme Court. That's been thousands of hours to find out if we have a vacancy, who are the best. And so we have a green list of 6 prospects that would be excellent. We have a red list of 4 that we think wouldn't be good. But we do a ton of research. And on some of these prospects, we even turn out 18-page summaries, not even the comprehensive research. But we spend a lot of time on that because it's possible we could have a vacancy this summer, and we can't go backwards if that happens. We have to pick up ground and gain ground. So we spend a lot of time and effort doing that. But I do want to mention, people say, well, the Supreme Court's not where it needs to be. And the response is, okay, but they're not where they were either. I mean, let's remember in 2022, they reversed Roe versus Wade, for crying out loud. And I remember talking to friends that were pro-life activists. They were shocked when it happened. And it wasn't because they weren't praying for it. They didn't see that it could happen.
Right.
And so for God to have done that and then also reversed Lemon versus Kurtzman, that was the Kennedy v. Bremerton case. A lot of people forget, too, in the summer of 2024, we had states that were literally taking Donald Trump off the presidential ballot, and it was the U.S. Supreme Court and the Trump v. Anderson case that put him back on. If it wasn't for the U.S. Supreme Court, we would have President Kamala Harris right now, along with everything that entails. And we could go on and on. So I know the court's not where we want them to be yet, but man, they're on their way. They're close, and we can get there from here.
Let's, we can, just before we run out of time, talk about how people can join with you. There are, of course, resources, events. There's a place where you can contact you. There's a place where you can support your organization. And most importantly, I would think, Phillip, you would be a great speaker to invite people to come to their church, come to their civic group, come to their political organization. And is any of that available in terms of educating people and mobilizing prayer?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's something that I love to do. And then getting people involved, getting people to come to our website. And the best thing that people can do is just sign up for our newsletter to get on our email list so that we can keep you posted on everything that's happening. And then I'll mention, too, we're going to be having another big event the first Monday of October called our National Consecration of Our Courts Gathering at the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. Dutch Sheets will be our keynote speaker. We'll have a number of other great leaders who will be leading in prayer during the day, but that's going to be huge. So I'd love for folks to sign up for that as well.
Well, let's get you back on just before that happens, maybe in September or even in August, so we can promote it a little bit more. Of course, we have been very much involved in helping to promote as we could what took place in the Museum of the Bible, where America reads the Bible, and that comes from our good friend Bunny Pounds, and we'll get into that some in the next hour. Let me just real quickly before you go also mention the book's about 180 pages, very readable. I think some people might think, well, okay, this guy's a lawyer, he's pretty smart, am I going to understand? And this, I think, has been done in a way that you can really follow the flow, understand how we got to where we are, and I think it would really encourage you to pray for the nation, especially as we're coming to this National Day of Prayer on Thursday. I would encourage you to not only get a copy of the book, but maybe get multiple copies of the book and encourage people to pray for the Supreme Court.
Thank you for saying that. And one of the best compliments I had was from a friend of mine who's a pastor, and he was kind of surprised. He said, "Phillip, I really like this book. It's very readable. It's not for lawyers." And I thought, that's what I wanted. I wanted it to be something that was approachable and fun and something that somebody could read on a Sunday afternoon, too. I think you could read it in 3 to 4 hours. And so anyway, that was the goal, and I hope it comes across that way.
It certainly does. And as you well know, I read quite a lot of books, and I found this one quite readable, and I would commend it to anybody. So, Phillip, thank you for being with us. We've mentioned you before. It's actually the first time we've actually had you on the program, and I'm sure there'll be future opportunities. So thank you for joining us today.
It's an honor to be with you. Thank you very much, Kerby. God bless you.
Well, let's take a break. When we come back, we have some other things to talk about, although, as you will see, by the time we get to this second hour, especially in the last half of the second hour, it'll come back to some of the things we've been talking about with Phillip, but we need to take a break. So we will take that break, and we'll come back with more right after this.
Many years ago, they began saying that we live in the information age. Well, today there is so much information coming at us from every direction The hardest thing is to discern which issues are really important and how can I make a positive impact without wasting my time trying to figure out accurate information. Let me give you a suggestion to help with that. Visit pointofview.net, look at the tabs across the top, find the one named Viewpoints. Kerby Anderson and others on our team are constantly watching for news to identify those issues that you really need to know about. They boil things down in a brief summary, and then you can decide if it's something on which you want to learn more and get involved. Again, when you go to pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints, you'll see exactly what I mean. You'll see the issues that we are covering right now. And when you like what you see, I honestly think you will, you can slide on over, enter your email, and get them automatically sent to your inbox each day. That's it. Take a minute now, be informed. Pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints. Point of View will continue after this. Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, going to spend some time working our way through some of the articles I've posted for you. And in some respects, these are a little bit of a review of what we talked about on Friday, but I wanted to expand it a little bit. And the first is a piece that Joseph Califant talks about. The Biden administration did what to Christians is the title of it. And it has to do with this Trump administration task force to eradicate anti-Christian bias, and has published a report in that regard, and gets into how they targeted various Christians through various policies and prosecutions. 200-page report that we talked about with Kelly Shackelford, and I might just mention that there's a very good press release about that, which we had on Friday, or you can go to First Liberty and find out some more. We will be talking about this much more because not only does it help us identify what went wrong, but some of the things the current administration is trying to do to change that in the future. But again, this has to do with how the Biden administration ignored religious exemptions, prioritized preferred constituencies over Christians, used policy and regulatory rules to eliminate statutory protections for religious Americans. What's so interesting is there are a number of you that listen to this program that are Catholic, and you would appreciate the fact that even though Joe Biden's a Catholic, at least a name only, there was something in the report that talked about how they wanted to have more leeway to target religious Catholics, one specifically saying he would like to prosecute any nun who still wears the head habit. I mean, that's how egregious some of this was. But nevertheless, one of the things the press release says is while this report details the egregious actions of the Biden administration against Christians, it also demonstrates how the Trump administration is restoring the rights of Christians and all Americans to practice their faith without fear or retribution. If you go to the press release that we posted on Friday, you can see that Kelly Shackelford talks about the fact that this report is shocking. The Biden administration's record of hostility towards Christian Americans, he says, is despicable and should serve as a warning. We should never let this happen again. We are grateful to the current administration for recognizing that religious liberty is a foundation to all of our constitutional freedoms and for working to protect our first freedom. And you might be thinking, well, didn't you just talk with Phillip about the Prodigal Court? Well, a lot of this, and I'll hold up our booklet that we came out with a number of years ago on a biblical point of view on the deep state, or what is oftentimes called the administrative establishment. And that is the fact that much of this was not happening through court rulings. It was happening through various, if you will, three-letter agencies and things of that nature. And so in some respects, you had, for example, the IRS targeting Christian churches and nonprofits sometimes. One of those is Christians Engaged. We'll get into that a little bit later when we talk about Bunny Pounds. You had the FBI going after certain groups. You have the DOJ, in some respects, working on certain issues and some of the cases against Grace New England, Summit Church, Anchorstone Christian School, Christian Church. We've talked about that before. And then, of course, you didn't just have the enforcement. Some of this which came from states, like we can think of Dad's Place in Bryan, Ohio, which we can talk about, or The Rock in Castle Rock, Colorado, or the Gethsemane Baptist Church in Arizona. Many of those examples that were all part of this particular report coming out, and now the task force to change that. And that is, in a sense, overlapping, but also separate from something else we talked about on Friday. And I'm going to have a commentary coming out on that, because the Justice Department also provided a document on how the Biden administration used the FACE Act in most cases against Christians. Now, okay, what's the FACE Act? FACE stands for Freedom to Access Clinic Entrances. Now, the original plan was to just have it protect abortion clinics, but there were amendments added so that basically the FACE Act can protect both pro-life groups and pro-choice or pro-abortion groups. And yet, if you remember, going back to when the abortion case came down and the Dobbs case overturned Roe versus Wade, Jeremy Dice, in the piece that we talked about on Friday, talked about how angry mobs took out their frustration on pro-life America by spray painting all sorts of threats of violence, and even some vandals throwing Molotov cocktails at pregnancy care centers. And so the FACE Act should be applied to both pro-abortion and pro-life groups. The Justice Department had the opportunity to deploy that evenly, but that's not what happened at all. And you can look at some of the numbers to look at the individuals that were prosecuted for any kind of violation, as in some cases praying in front of an abortion clinic. By contrast, you had zero prosecutions. Later, I think there were half a dozen, when there was so much press about prosecuting some of those individuals that were involved in all sorts of attacks on pregnancy resource centers. So the bottom line is, we've sort of been following this for some time. Now we have pretty good documentation. The first one, of course, is this about 200-page report, and now a task force to actually go out there and make a difference. And again, the Justice Department said the task force to eradicate anti-Christian bias publishes a report detailing how the Biden administration's prosecutions, policies, and practices demonstrated anti-Christian bias through the federal government. You had some of the same things being posted by a number of key individuals. And whether you are pro-life or pro-abortion, you have to recognize that if we cannot accept and have the Justice Department apply the law in the sense evenly without bias, then we are certainly going to be moving in a very dangerous direction. And I think you're starting to see a fair number of liberals and progressives saying, you know, we really do need to take this issue on, because it could be someday, instead of debanking pro-life groups or debanking Second Amendment groups, they could be, I don't know, debanking Planned Parenthood or the National Abortion Rights League, or we could all of a sudden have all sorts of groups attacking some of these very important liberal organizations. And if the Justice Department has said, well, you know, in the past, the Biden administration turned a blind eye to what happened to conservative and Christian groups, we'll turn a blind eye to what happens to you. That's not what we want. We want an even application of the laws and policies across the board. And so, again, I thought it would be helpful for you to see maybe a summary some of the material we talked about on Friday, and to recognize that help is on the way. But a lot of this, as we talked about in the first hour, isn't necessarily happening with the courts. It's happening with the administrative state, or what we call the deep state. And we'll keep watching that and talking about that on Point of View. But let's take a break. We'll be back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The editors of National Review said it best with their headline, Manufacturing Racism. They were talking about the recent revelations about the Southern Poverty Law Center. A half-century ago, when it began, it was doing responsible work by pointing to racism and encouraging laws and governments to bring about change. 2 weeks ago, the Department of Justice announced an 11-count indictment against the center on charges of wire fraud, false statements to a bank, and conspiracy to commit money laundering. Apparently, the leaders had been secretly funding informants and providing funds to racist organizations, essentially manufacturing racism to supposedly fight racism. An even greater concern for many Christian organizations has been the center's attempt to label worthwhile Christian and conservative groups with a hate label. Their so-called research led the group to attack groups like the Family Research Council, American Family Association, Alliance Defending Freedom, Focus on the Family, Turning Point USA, and Moms for Liberty. We've also learned that the federal government has used their materials to indoctrinate soldiers and encourage federal agencies to investigate law-abiding Americans. We've been told by some of the leaders that Christian nationalist and conservative haters are the greatest threat to America's security. Will this indictment lead to convictions? When we discussed the issue on my radio program, we concluded that it may not result in criminal convictions, even though the center was certainly defrauding their donor base. The latest news has been an embarrassment for the center and has served to educate many Americans about the harm that they have inflicted on worthwhile organizations. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let's we can talk about our politicized culture, and to illustrate the fact that as we're talking about this right now, this has been around for some time. I'll hold up our booklet. This one was written in 2017, so it is, I guess, 9 years old. And yet, even back then, we were talking about how politicized the culture was, the need for civility. Matter of fact, a good portion of that booklet has to do with civility. And it brings us to this very good piece by Beckett Adams. And I would commend it to you. Sometimes we post these articles for you to reprint, and I would encourage you to reprint these. Certainly we post them so you can read them anytime, but this one certainly would maybe be worthwhile reprinting, or at least taking the time to read it all the way through, because it's 7 pages, and it's called The Political Violence Whataboutism Has Gotten Out of Control. Now, whataboutism is whenever, as we had a week ago, the shooting or the attempted assassination of the president and his cabinet, the argument is, well, we certainly have people on the left that want to kill the president and want to kill people that are part of his administration. And immediately you get, well, what about, and then that's part of the issue that Beckett Adams is addressing. And he gives you some facts, some history, some graphs. And so if you've ever had one of those conversations with somebody, this would be good for you to read, or even better to print out and hand to them, because Beckett Adams says, look, nearly as great a problem as left-wing violence is the left's refusal to admit it as a problem. Because oftentimes whenever a Republican or a conservative is shot at, stabbed, or even killed or beaten, the activist adopts one of three responses. One, the violence was deserved. He had it coming. Two, it didn't happen. It's a hoax. And three, well, we have right-wing violence and it's worse. And he says of the third is the most annoying. We'll get to that in just a minute, because it's just raw whataboutism. But because the counterexamples that are offered are oftentimes, and he's being nice at first, mischaracterizations. And he says in most cases we're talking about outright falsehoods. And so again, there is so often we got violence on both sides. Well, first of all, when there has been any kind of what could be right-wing violence, the conservative groups come out almost without even any prompting to condemn what is taking place. But here is a good example, because he says here, as a left-wing would-be assassin tried to murder President Trump at the annual White House Correspondents Association dinner, he said this now marked the third such plot against the president. You can talk about some of those others. And he says, interestingly enough, we live in a world where a Bernie Sanders volunteer can try to murder the congressional caucus and nearly killed, who now is the House Majority Leader, Steve Scalise. And yet the argument that you heard on MSNBC is, well, I've looked at his voting record. He had it coming. Or when Charlie Kirk has his neck shot and a left-wing columnist says, well, yeah, but look at some of the things he said. And again, this idea he had it coming. But that's the first argument. The second one is even more troubling for those of us that live in the same world with people that buy into these conspiracies. Because Beckett Adams says, speaking of assassins' bullets, we live in a world where Trump can survive a sniper attack, one in which a man was killed, two others were gravely wounded, and there's even a picture of the bullet flying behind Trump's bloodied head, and 47% of Democrats, these would be Kamala Harris voters, believe the incident was orchestrated by his supporters to increase sympathy for him. It's a hoax. By the way, that poll was done by the Manhattan Institute, and we are dealing with not quite a majority, but close to a majority of individuals that think it was a hoax. And, of course, you saw the number of people that said the attack on the White House correspondents was a hoax. And, I mean, there comes a point in time where you just say, well, we really can't get to this any further. But, again, he reminds us in some detail of all the attempted assassination of Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh, the murder of Charlie Kirk, the firebombing of Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro's home by a pro-Hamas supporter, a Jewish couple gunned down in Washington, D.C. by a gunman shouting Free Palestine, multiple shooting attacks at ICE facilities, a violent week-long siege of federal courthouse in Portland, social justice themes, as well as what we just talked about a minute ago, the various crisis pregnancy centers, pro-life groups vandalized or firebombed since the Dobbs decision. And you constantly hear, yes, but the right-wing violence is worse. And so you usually get one of a few particular individuals. And I think it's helpful because Beckett Adams takes each one. I'm going to give you a very quick overview. The first one is Paul Pelosi. That is the husband of Nancy Pelosi. And this was an individual that attacked him, but he was an anti-war activist, a nudist, a man who'd been homeless and unstable. And to say that he was a right-wing person attacking Paul Pelosi, it's even hard for me to even take that seriously, but they go into the details of it. Another one is Gretchen Whitmer. Our listeners in Michigan would understand that there was this kidnapping plot, and probably has more legs about a whataboutism, because you do have some individuals. But again, there were all sorts of undercover informants, at least 12, equaling almost the number of plotters. And of those who were charged, 5 were acquitted because the defense successfully argued that this was entrapment by the FBI. The next one, of course, is Gabby Giffords. I won't go into much of the detail there, but this is a paranoid schizophrenic, was not an individual that was a right-wing political ideologue or anything of that nature. If anything, this is a very crazed individual who had no political ideology, which is why you mostly hear now, when they want to make a case that there's violence on both sides, the story of Melissa Hortman in Minnesota. And both Melissa Hortman and her husband, Mark Hortman, were murdered in June of 2025. The alleged killer is identified as a Trump supporter, anti-abortion, but also was claiming that he was a U.S. military-trained covert assassin. If you look at his voting records, he for a while supported Republicans, but having now no party affiliation, was apprehended, did have some anti-Trump paraphernalia with him, so it doesn't look like he was that much of a pro-Trump conservative. He also was an individual that claimed he was trained by the U.S. military. He wrote the Minnesota governor, Tim Walz, who said Tim Walz told him to kill Democratic Senators Amy Klobuchar and Tina Smith because the governor wanted to be a senator. Okay, this is just a crazy individual. And again, what is so interesting is whenever there's a shooting of a conservative, oftentimes what individuals do is bring out the story and the name Melissa Hortman. But here is where Beckett Adams helps you out, because he actually shows you the Google trends and shows that when, of course, she was shot, that was a very significant trend. But then the trend went up again. It went, in fact, disappeared, went up again when Charlie Kirk was assassinated. So the idea is that many times people will not even talk about what happened to Melissa Hortman, which is horrible, and actually had a plan to kill some other individuals as well. But it gets trotted out, and he shows how it was trotted out when Charlie Kirk was assassinated, trotted out again when you had the No Kings weekend protest, and then trotted out just a week ago with the assassination attempt of the White House Correspondents' Dinner. And I think if nothing else, it just illustrates again that what we are talking about here is the attempt to keep saying, well, there's violence on both sides. And as he points out, yes, there is red right-wing violence sometimes, but the tendency is not to slough it off, as we've seen Democrats do. He says, ask any ordinary Republican legislature how far right is too right, and they'll give you names. Nick Fuentes, Alex Jones, Tucker Carlson. If you ask them, have they ever apologized for right-wing violence, he says they will do it even without being prompted. And I think it's just an illustration, as we've said before, that now, as you will see with my commentary, we also recognize that some of the things that were attributed to right-wing violence were paid for by the left-wing Southern Poverty Law Center. So the last page, interesting enough, of the Beckett Adams article, which I make available to you, actually connects up to my Viewpoints commentary today on manufacturing racism, which we've talked about before, which we found out that the Southern Poverty Law Center was actually sending money to some of those groups and, in a sense, creating that opportunity for whataboutism. Anyway, perhaps one of the best articles I've ever seen. If you ever find yourself in a discussion about that, this article's on the website at pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places. And some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you. Now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give to Point of View today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, let me just mention later in the week we have Dr. Paul Kenger, and we'll also be talking with former Senator from Pennsylvania, Rick Santorum. Bill Federer will be with us as we get back to some of the things we'll be talking about right now in terms of the Bible and this very significant gathering called Rededicate 250. So a couple more articles that you might want to find on the website at pointofview.net. And one of those comes from our good friend Jerry Newcomb. America needs the Bible, he says. The Bible is needed by America more than ever. I think America needs prayer, which we'll be talking about in just a minute. And he says, thankfully, at the Museum of the Bible last week, we had various leaders read through the whole book, from Genesis to Revelation, and even the President of the United States participated. He wrote a commentary a while back about that, an ambitious Bible reading plan. AmericaReadsTheBible.com, if you want to go there and certainly find that link. Of course, he has it on his particular article that we've posted as well. Said that in honor of the 250th birthday of the United States, America Reads the Bible serves as a spiritual celebration of our nation's founding ideals and a call to rediscover the truth that still anchors today. Just in Bible days, when the scriptures were read, revival would often break out, and the organizers of America Reads the Bible desire the same outcome. I will give Jerry Newcomb credit because, as I've pointed out before, poor Bunny Pounds, who is the one that came up with this idea, article after article has talked about the concept, talked about the vision, and never talked about the person that had the vision. And you heard her on this program talk about her vision. She is the head, of course, of Christians Engaged, but on this program was talking about her vision of having people read through the Bible, and she was able to get that put together through our friends at the Museum of the Bible, and then work through Pure Flix to have a live stream so that you could actually watch it if you would like to do so. And you had all sorts of faith leaders involved with that, including, as Jerry Newcomb points out, you had President Donald Trump read 2 Chronicles 7, verses 11 to 22, which, of course, is a powerful call for Israel at the time to humble itself, pray, and return to God. A lot of people try to apply that to America today, and I think the general principle is there, but the promise there in 2 Chronicles is to the nation of Israel. But certainly, does God honor prayer of faithful believers? Of course he does. And so I think that fits as well. Well, back to the Bible for just a few minutes. Jerry Newcomb also reminds us that the federal government, under, at that time, Ronald Reagan, declared 1983 as the year of the Bible. And he also then gives us some of the statements being made then. Not that I agree with all of them, but if nothing else, I would probably agree with them more then than what they would write now, which shows you how much has changed since the 1980s. Newsweek magazine in 1982 said, for centuries, the Bible has exerted an unrivaled influence on American culture, politics, and social life. So far, so good. Now historians are discovering the Bible, perhaps even more than the Constitution, is our founding document. Still, so far, so good. The source of the powerful myth, of the United States as a special sacred nation, people called by God to establish a model society, a beacon to the world. Now, I know what they're getting at, and that is the promises, as I just illustrated a minute ago, in 2 Chronicles 7 are to the nation of Israel. The United States is not Israel, so I get that. But the myth that there's somehow this country is exceptional, well, it is exceptional. I mean, let's face it, it is very different than many other countries around the world when it was formed and even to this day. But we'll leave it at that. And certainly the idea that the Bible is a founding document wasn't so controversial back in 1982, even in Newsweek magazine. Again, I will hold up, if you want, some of the booklets that we've made available, One Nation Under God and the Patriot Preachers and the Federalist Papers and all the other ones that we've been making available. The most recent ones are on the Declaration of Independence and America's founding, and every one of those booklets in one place, either an extensive part of the booklet or part of the booklet, makes that documentation very, very clear. But then he also quotes from something else many years later from Time magazine, in which it was asking a question, whatever happened to ethics? Good question. And again, Time magazine wrote, ours is the only country deliberately founded on a good idea. Again, so far so good. That good idea combines a commitment to man's inalienable rights with a Calvinist belief in the ultimate moral right and sinful man's obligation to do good. These articles of faith embodied in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution literally govern our lives today. Just a reminder for some of you that are younger listeners, back in 1982 on Newsweek magazine, 1987 in Time magazine, they were saying the kinds of things that we say around this table here at Point of View, but you probably would have to look long and hard and probably come up with nothing if you were to look at the so-called legacy press today to see them saying anything like this. But not so long ago, in terms of America's history, 250 years, you go back 40 plus years, and a lot of those statements were being made in Time magazine, in Newsweek magazine, and I appreciate Jerry Newcomb for pulling them out. I may find a place somewhere to put those quotes in a future booklet or Outlook magazine just so you have access to that. But then he reminds us of something else. Not only were people literate because they read, for example, the New England Primer, but they were also biblically literate. And so as a result, that was the way in which they could understand many of the speeches that were given at the time. He points out that for the first couple of centuries, even of this country, but certainly in Western culture, the number one book was the Bible, found in virtually every home. The number two book was Pilgrim's Progress, written by John Bunyan, which, of course, is based on the Bible. And then he gives us a couple of illustrations. Let's look first at George Washington. Father of our country, knew the Bible well, and phrases from its pages flow into his writings and his speeches. He says the public and private statements drip with phraseology from the Bible. And again, Jerry Newcomb and Peter Lillebeck are the individuals that wrote the book George Washington's Sacred Fire, and they point out that they have an entire appendix in that book of all the phrases from the Bible that were used in the speeches by George Washington. Measure of antiquity, the Edict of Pharaoh, bricks without straw, the Lord of hosts, the Lord gives and takes, the Lord and ruler of nations. You know, it is interesting today that you will have people that will read the speeches of George Washington and say, well, I don't think he was a Christian. He really didn't know that much about the Bible. And these historians that make that statement, not the ones that we have on this program, but others, they say that because They don't know the Bible. By the way, measure of antiquity, that one was new for me, but bricks without straws and the Lord gives and takes. Well, these are phrases we would know if you are biblically literate. But the sad reality is that many of our historians have not read the Bible, have not even memorized parts of the Bible, so they miss the fact that these were allusions to phrases that were understood by biblically literate people at the time. He also points out that the first president's favorite Bible verse was Micah 4:4, "But they shall set every man under his vine and under his fig tree, and none shall make them afraid, for the mouth of the Lord of hosts has spoken it." And so, if nothing else, he just once again reminds us of all the places, if you do ever get a chance to travel to Washington, D.C., where you see Bible verses. For example, you have 3 Bible verses chiseled in stone, which are in the Lincoln Memorial, which were part of his second inaugural address. If you go to Philadelphia, you can see the Liberty Bell. It has a Bible verse on it. "Proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants thereof." Well, you might not know that, but it comes from Leviticus 25, verse 10. And, of course, he quotes even somebody who would probably less likely to be much of a church-going individual, Andrew Jackson, who summed it up best, in which he said, "The Bible is the rock upon which our republic rests." And so, if nothing else, it's just a reminder that America needs the Bible, and we have just had an event in which you had the reading of the Bible. And so if you would like to know more about that, of course, we've had those links up there before, but you can simply do a search for AmericaReadsTheBible.com, and you will find them. And I think you will find that to be very encouraging. So if what precedes a revival is the reading of the Bible, when we come back, what is happening in Washington, D.C. that might be one of many events that bring about a revival? We'll talk about that right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Thought I'd spend just a little bit of time talking about what's going to be happening on May 17th. And this is an event that will be taking place on the Washington Mall. It reminded me, at least, of the 1980 Washington for Jesus rally, which was also held at the National Mall back in April in 1980. I was able to attend that because I was there at the time going to graduate school at Georgetown University. You had Bill Bright and Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell and John Jimenez and a variety of other individuals speaking, all sorts of individuals. And interestingly enough, that event reminded me of this one. But I'm going to also quote from Robert Jeffress, who says, in some respects, he thinks this event could reminded him of something that took place here in Dallas, which was called Expo 72. So again, we will probably talk more about this, especially on, I guess it would be May 15th on that Friday weekend edition, maybe even the day before, about that, because we will certainly want to be watching that. But this article from the Christian Post says it this way: thousands are expected to gather at the National Mall next month for a massive day of prayer and worship aimed at calling the United States back to God ahead of its 250th anniversary, with one pastor predicting it could be the nation's largest religious gathering in more than 50 years. What's so interesting is that you have multiple administration officials and many conservative faith leaders who say they will be attending and will speak at the May 17th. And it's called Rededicate 250, a national jubilee of prayer, praise, and thanksgiving. The event is one of many festivities, I might mention, that are planned to be part of a nationwide Freedom 250 celebration of the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence and the founding of the United States. Now, interestingly enough, Pastor Robert Jeffress, and I've asked Steve, who's not with us today, but when he gets back to see if he could get Robert Jeffress at First Baptist Church to maybe come and speak about that, because he's one of the individuals scheduled to speak at the event. And he's likened it to Expo 72. Now, if you're not familiar with that, and you probably aren't, unless you watch the Jesus Revolution film done by the Irwin brothers, because they do talk about that, because in 1972, Campus Crusade for Christ, now known as Cru, had a conference that was attended by more than 80,000 college and high school students. My wife was part of that. A couple I was with yesterday, they were part of that. And it was a 5-day gathering in which they gathered there at the Cotton Bowl. And many people think that it was really at the height of what was called the Jesus movement. You had Billy Graham, and you had Chris Christopherson, and you had Jimmy Cash. And I mean, it was a who's who of individuals that were there. And I thought it was kind of interesting. Robert Jeffress compared what is going to happen on May 17th to what happened on Expo 72 here in Dallas. But also, Robert Jeffress went on to say, I believe that President Donald Trump believes, yes, we should celebrate the 250th birthday of America, and we'll do it in a great and glorious way. But it's also time, he believes, for America to rededicate itself to God. And so that was a statement by Robert Jeffress. He went on to say, if America is going to experience revival, then I first have to have a revival in my heart, he says. For America to rededicate herself to Christ means I must rededicate myself to Christ. And that's the angle that I'm going to take in my talk, he says, on the National Mall on May 17th. For those of you that would like to maybe take some notes, let me talk about what are the 3 pillars of what is going to happen at this rededication. Again, it's called Rededicate 250, a national jubilee for prayer, praise, and thanksgiving. There are 3 pillars. First pillar is this: the miracles that made us. The miracles that made us, which really consist of a reflection of God's providence through the 250 years, something that George Washington spoke about, wrote about, and certainly others have as well, honoring faith that inspired America's founders and has carried us forward in every generation since. So the first pillar is miracles that made us. The second pillar is the miracles still in our midst. And that will really feature kind of the personal testimonies of God's healing in our lives and in our land. And then the third pillar is called a new birth of faith and freedom, which will involve a collective expression of gratitude for 250 years of freedom. And that will be include a guided and unified moment of rededication, asking for God's blessing, guidance, and grace for the next 250 years. Now, again, if you go down the list of who's speaking, first of all, I mentioned some of the cabinet members, but let's start with the House Speaker, Mike Johnson. He's been on the program with us before. He is slated to speak. The Secretary of War, or Secretary of Defense, whatever you want to say, Pete Hegseth. The Chief of Protocol, Monica Crowley. The Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, is going to actually deliver a video message. Ben Carson, who served, as you might remember, as Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, retired neurosurgeon, will also give some remarks. And then if you look at some of the people that we've had on this program that will be speaking, I'll just give you the short list. Pastor Jack Graham of Prestonwood Baptist Church, Pastor Jensen Franklin of course, the Georgia Free Chapel, Pastor Jonathan Pokluda, an individual we've had on the program many times when we've done our Next Generation Roundtable with the Harris Creek Baptist Church, Pastor Gary Hamrick of Cornerstone Chapel in Virginia, and also Reverend Samuel Rodriguez, who is the head and president of the National Hispanic Christian Leadership. As you might imagine, of course, you also have Franklin Graham, Billy Graham's son, who leads, of course, Samaritan's Purse. You also have a number of other notable individuals we've had on the program, people like Eric Metaxas, who is a radio talk show host and author, Sissy Graham Lynch, and a variety of others that are there. You'll, of course, have the U.S. Marine Band and a variety of other topics, but nevertheless wanted you to know about this opportunity called Rededicate 250 on May 17th. For those of you that live near that area, you may want to attend it. Some of you may want to attend it because it may be the largest religious gathering in the last half century, and maybe you would like to book a ticket, so I want you to know about it ahead of time. But nevertheless, just a great opportunity for us to rededicate ourselves to the Lord. And don't forget about this Thursday. You might remember back in 1952, President Harry Truman signed a resolution declaring an annual National Day of Prayer. 1988, President Reagan signed into law designating the first Thursday of May as a time for a National Day of Prayer. I would encourage you to be involved in those activities, be listening to us on that day, also listening to your local radio station. They may be talking about events happening in your community, and I would encourage you to pray for America. Already talked about praying for those people on the Supreme Court, praying for those in positions of leadership. 1 Timothy 2 encourages us, really mandates us for us to pray for those in authority. So let me encourage you to do that as well. But that's all we have for today. I hope that this has been a great discussion of the parable of the Prodigal Court. That's in the first hour. I've given you a number of very good articles today that you might want to use, including ones about the importance of the Bible and this very significant religious gathering. And I am privileged to have both Megans helping me today. Megan 1 and Megan 2 helping us both with engineering the program and producing the program. Steve is out, but I believe he'll be back with us tomorrow, so I hope you'll be back with us tomorrow right here on Point of View.
The Bible tells us not to worry. And yet, there is a lot of worrying stuff in our world today. Thankfully, the Bible doesn't stop at telling us not to worry. God gives us a next step. He says we need to pray. But sometimes, even knowing what to pray can be difficult. And that is why Point of View has relaunched our Pray for America movement, a series of weekly emails to guide you in prayer for our nation. Each week, you'll receive a brief update about a current issue affecting Americans, along with a written prayer that you can easily share with others. We'll also include a short free resource for you in each email so you can learn more about the issue at hand. Will you commit to pray for America? Go to pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner at the top of the page to subscribe. Again, that's pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in America. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.